Well, we welcome you to another installment of Joe and Josh Discuss Genesis. And today we are in Genesis chapter 48, beginning in verse 1. We're hitting the home stretch.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. This is good stuff, though. Today's going to be interesting.
Yeah, we have a lot of material to get through in just a short number of verses, but you're right. These are verses that are rich with history, theology, prophecy. The theology will be the interesting thing, too. There's a lot of interesting theology here. So if we are in chapter 48 here, do you want to start us out? How far do you think we should go? I probably at least to verse 7, we can get through the first paragraph, and then we'll move on to 8, which I think is going to occupy a lot of our time.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. All right, so we'll pick up at the top of the chapter. It says, after this, Joseph was told, your father is ill. So he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. When Jacob was told, your son Joseph has come to you, he summoned his strength and sat up in bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and he blessed me, and he said to me, I'm going to make you fruitful and increase your numbers. I will make of you a company of peoples, and will give you this land to your offspring after you for a perpetual holding. Therefore, your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are now mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are. As for the offspring born to you after them, they shall be yours. They shall be recorded under the names of their brothers with regard to their inheritance. For I have come from Paddan. Rachel, alas, died in the land of Canaan on the way, while we were some distance from Ephrathah, and I buried her there on my way to Ephrathah, that is Bethlehem.
So this gets us into an interesting trivia question, which is, what are the 12 tribes of Israel? Because we would assume, reading the story so far, we've heard that there are 12 tribes of Israel. We've heard that there are 10 lost tribes of Israel and all of that, which is not exactly accurate. But we would assume the 12 tribes of Israel are the 12 sons of Jacob. He has 12 sons, and there are 12 tribes.
Right.
But that's not right.
Yeah, it gets a little confusing, doesn't it?
It does. So we've been talking throughout our discussion about the birth order and about how important that is to the story, and about the fact that underneath this story is wrangling over who would get the birthright and the blessing, just like happened in the story of Jacob and Esau.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that felt really forced to any of our listeners. I don't know how it felt to you, Minister Joe, but I kept insisting on it.
Mm-hmm.
And that bears fruit here. Joseph brings both of his sons to Jacob because Joseph knows he's the heir.
Mm-hmm.
And Joseph is going to get a double portion, which means whatever his brothers get, Joseph gets double that. So he expects his two sons to receive inheritance, his double portion. And Jacob confirms that that's exactly what's going to happen. There's going to be no tribe of Joseph. Instead, there are going to be two tribes from Joseph, one named Ephraim and the other Manasseh. And he specifically says they will become to me as Reuben and Simeon. Why mention them? Well, they're the firstborn, the two firstborn of Leah. So he's confirming that Joseph is getting the birthright. These two are leapfrogging over the two oldest children, Reuben and Simeon. And they're going to be the heads of the family, the grandchildren. So that's what he's saying. But it leaves us with a pickle, right? Because he's got 12 sons.
Right.
And now Joseph is becoming 2. So that leaves 13. But we know there are only 12 tribal territories. So how do we make sense of all of this mess? So when they finally get to the land, And Moses starts the process of distributing the land among the tribes, and then Joshua completes that. But Moses does it on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and Joshua will be part of distributing the tribal allotments on the western side of the Jordan River. We end up with 12 tribal territories, not 13. And you might say, of course not. Levi is going to be the priesthood, and they don't get a tribal allotment. So it must be the other 11 and the extra one of Joseph. But that's not right either, because one of Joseph's sons, Manasseh, gets 2 tribal allotments. So now we have 14. How do we get 12? That's the question. So here's the solution to that problem, and then we'll talk about how all this maybe worked. So the interesting thing that occurs, and it all is based on the stories we've been reading together in the book of Genesis, why everything goes this way. So that's why it's maybe useful to talk about. So the tribal allotments, starting in the north in Israel, and we'll count them out here. Asher is first, he's along the coast. Naphtali, Zebulun, Issachar. Those are in the north, near to the Sea of Galilee, but they're on the western side of Galilee. So that's 4. Then we have the western tribe of Manasseh and the eastern tribe of Manasseh. That's 6. Then we have Gad. Then we have Ephraim. Now we're at 8, if you're keeping track.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have Dan and Benjamin. That's 10. Reuben, that's 11. And Judah, that's 12. Levi's missing because he's going to be the priesthood. But what other tribe is missing?
Simeon, right?
Simeon. Where is Simeon? Well, Simeon does not get a tribal allotment of his own. He receives a series of cities around Beersheba in the tribe of Judah. So when the northern and southern split happens later, and we're not going to get into Samuel and Kings and all that, so it's useful to talk about it here.
Mm-hmm.
When that happens and the north and south divide, it's not so easy as Judah and everybody else. Judah is the largest southern tribe, but Simeon is part of Judah. So the southern kingdom includes Simeon's cities, which are within the tribe of Judah, some of Benjamin, none of Dan, because even though Dan is on the border between Judah and Ephraim originally, they don't like living there. In the book of Judges, they can't, that's where the Philistines are and some other powerful nations, and they can't take the land. So they leave, they abscond, and they go way north, north of Naphtali, north of the most northern tribe. And so they're not there when the split occurs. They're way up north. So, but Benjamin some of Benjamin gets absorbed into Judah. And there's some evidence in Genesis, if you've been reading it closely, that Jerusalem may actually not be in the tribe of Judah. It may be in the tribe of Benjamin. It depends on who you're reading. But anyway, so Benjamin, Simeon, and Judah become the southern tribe. And David has a huge number of warriors from Benjamin, so there might be some loyalty there. And then the northern tribes who get, quote unquote, lost are the tribes of Dan, Ephraim, the 2 tribes of Manasseh, Gad, Issachar, Zebulun, Asher, and Naphtali. They're the ones who get conquered by the Assyrian Empire. And I'm a bit of a loss with the tribe of Reuben. Technically, Reuben is on the west side of the Dead Sea. He's south, parallel with Judah. But I think Reuben has troubles way before the big falls because of all the conflicts with Moab and Ammon and Edom. And I think Reuben is pretty minuscule way before the collapse. So how many tribes are lost? And they're not really lost as so much as they're displaced. Some of them were certainly taken out of the Holy Land, but a lot of them became the Samaritans in the days of Jesus. They intermarried with Assyrians, and they started to worship a little differently, and they became the Samaritans. But the lost tribes are officially Asher, Naphtali, Zebulun, Issachar, Manasseh, Gad, and Ephraim, maybe Reuben.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's the long story. So based on everything we've read, is it interesting that Levi and Simeon are the two that don't get their own tribal allotments? They're the ones that actually get displaced by Joseph's two sons.
Right. Right. We know why.
That was a big deal to Jacob, wasn't it? When they
Yes.
killed the Shechemites. This has
Yes.
long time effect on them. Now, of course, the Levites have a very prestigious position. They're going to become priests. And they'll have cities.
Mm-hmm.
Simeon doesn't even get that.
Yeah.
Simeon just gets a few cities in the tribe of Judah, which ends up being a blessing because when the northern kingdom falls and Judah survives, Simeon survives with it.
Mm-hmm.
But he was the older.
Mm-hmm.
He was the elder, so it's possible that some of this history unfolds this way because he was held more responsible.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, it's interesting how the stories we've been reading in Genesis play out in some geopolitical ways throughout the rest of history.
Right. And so when you were talking about Reuben, the thought came to my mind that maybe is that modern day Gaza?
No, Gaza today is in the tribe of Judah.
Okay. It might be helpful for our listeners to try to get a modern day concept. One of the things that stood out to me right away was the order, and whether that's intentional in the way that the Genesis writer is writing. But you notice it. I like that portion where it says Joseph took Manasseh and Ephraim, and that's the order he uses there. But in verse 5, Jacob says, "These two sons born to you will be mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon." I think you alluded a little to that they're taking their places, but I also want to point out the order is opposite of what was said in the first verse.
Yeah, and I think that'll become important later because technically we find out that Manasseh's the elder and Ephraim's the younger. But Jacob is going to invert that. So more or less what Joseph is doing is he's saying, okay, I'm your heir, so I get the double portion, and Manasseh is my heir, so he should get the double portion.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because I just explained this whole history. We're going to see it soon. Jacob's going to invert the order, but Manasseh does get the double portion. He gets 2 tribes when Moses brings them into the land, which Jacob had nothing to do with. So there's a question we're going to ask is, did God agree with Jacob?
Yeah, well, he's and what we're talking about as well too is that breaking a bit of a tradition with the firstborn and the chosen and with the blessing.
Right. I mean, at least Jacob is within something of the history by choosing the firstborn of Rachel.
Right. Yeah.
Joseph is not technically his firstborn. Reuben is.
Right.
We've already said Reuben disqualified himself. Simeon and Levi disqualified themselves. Judah is the heir over there.
Yep.
But he chooses Joseph. And you could say, well, Joseph is the firstborn of Rachel, so maybe there's some logic there. Mm-hmm. The question is there any logic with the Ephraim and Manasseh other than Jacob's desire to relive his own childhood somehow?
Right. Technically, though, would you disagree with me? Technically, if we were to follow the tradition of Abraham, did he not give? Am I out on a limb here with Ishmael? Was there a type of?
There is a blessing for Ishmael because God makes a covenant himself personally with Hagar and Ishmael. But whether Abraham had anything to do with that, I don't think so. Yeah. Though he does give gifts. Before he gives his inheritance away, he gives gifts to all of his children. Mm-hmm. But that's all they get. They don't get any of Isaac's inheritance, just the gifts he gives. But God does make a covenant separately with Ishmael and Hagar.
My point in saying that is probably, in some ways, if Jacob, because he had Leah was his wife, there's a duplicity here that I'm just trying to say, or parallel, that technically could he have given an equal blessing to Reuben?
He won't do it for Reuben because of the history,
Because of
but
what he
I
did.
think he does give a comparable blessing to Judah.
Yeah. Okay.
In fact, and we'll get to this maybe a little more in our next discussion when we actually look at the blessings that Jacob has for all of his sons.
Right.
But we remember the story of Jacob and Esau when Isaac gives his blessing to Jacob. Jacob steals it, really deceives Isaac, who had every intention of giving the blessing and the birthright to Esau. Jacob fools him with his mother's help. And then Esau comes in and he says to his father, I'm ready. And his father goes, I've already given it. Who was it that just ate with me? And Esau says, don't you have another blessing for me?
Right.
And Isaac says, I'm sorry, I only have the one. But then he comes up with something really quickly on the spot, but it was unprepared. Jacob seems to be correcting that. Jacob actually prepares a blessing for all of his sons. That seems to be a correction. Something that he did that his father did not prepare to do. And that innovation has huge cosmic ramifications because all of his sons will become part of the covenant people. And that doesn't happen with Esau. So Jacob he makes a course correction here that's quite innovative. We didn't see it with Abraham. We didn't see it with Isaac, but Jacob does it and it changes the future.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot more detail in Genesis concerning Jacob's life than I would in comparison to Isaac's experience. Are we saying by saying that maybe there was more human element in some of this blessing?
Well, God honors it, and we're going to see, that's what I was sort of bringing up. We're going to see momentarily that Jacob tries to give the larger blessing to Ephraim. And there's a way in which God honors that in the days of Moses and Joshua, but not fully, because Manasseh God divides the birthright and blessing between Ephraim and Manasseh when he distributes the land in a way that Jacob doesn't seem to anticipate. He doesn't give them both to one of them. So the blessing goes to Ephraim, and through Ephraim, the northern kings will come. But the birthright, the double portion, goes to Manasseh, who gets two tribal allotments. So in the days of Joshua, God does carry out Jacob's wishes here to a degree, but not entirely. So Jacob's words are not determinative for the future. God would have to establish them. And many of them God does establish, like he does choose to bring the Messiah from Judah, which is anticipated in Jacob's blessing. So, I mean, there's a number of different things. That's really 49, but so we're talking a little ahead of the game.
Yeah,
but we shouldn't think of Jacob as, I don't believe we should think of either of the two things I'm going to say. I don't think we should think of Jacob as speaking God's word unfiltered as though he's a prophet. But neither do I think we should think that everything Jacob says God is beholden to do.
Right.
It's somewhere in between. Like Jacob is writing these blessings. I'm sure that there's a measure of faith, and I'm sure God is in it. You can tell God is in some of them. But in the end, God has to decide whether to do as Jacob says. It's really in God's hands to do it. And we don't see any evidence that Jacob consulted God about these. Maybe he did, but we don't see it. And the way I see God bringing about the fulfillment of some of what Jacob says, it's not exactly as Jacob says it. And I think that's good evidence that this is historical. Because in my undergrad, there were a large number of people. I would say the majority, not my undergrad, in my graduate studies for my master's degree, I'd say the majority of the professors were under the impression that people like Martin Noth and a few other German scholars were correct, and that Israel was just 12 unrelated tribes that tried to craft a history for themselves to say that they were of one family, to unify them, and they invented the story of the patriarchs to do that. A lot of my graduate studies professors believed that and taught that and had us read books that argued that and so on. I think the evidence here is that if you were doing that, this would be cleaner. If it was invented after the fact, I suspect this is a real tradition, and it's not fulfilled exactly as Jacob imagines it will be.
Right. Yeah.
God does his own thing. I think that's evidence that it is, in fact, historical and not an invented story. I would expect an invented story to be more seamless.
Yeah. A little more cleaner.
Yeah. So anyway,
Yeah.
so I'm going to make you, so Jacob refers to this, and before we started to record, we did a little bit of this discussion so we could find it. We were trying to decide, and if you're confused as listeners, we were confused too. Which incident of God's appearing to Jacob is he referencing in verse 3? Just a quick observation that Jacob says to Joseph, God revealed himself as God Almighty. That's the name El Shaddai. That's what we've been saying. That's the way God revealed himself to the patriarchs. And Jacob passes that name on to Joseph. Remember I said when Moses asked God's name in Exodus 3, Moses expected to hear El Shaddai, because that's how God was revealed to his ancestors. That would have helped him identify that this was in fact the same God. But God surprises, I think, Moses and says, I didn't reveal myself to Abraham by this name, but here's my name, I am. It's an interesting twist. But here we see Jacob passing down the name, El Shaddai, to Joseph. And then he says that this God revealed himself to him at Luz in the land of Canaan. That was the original name. Jacob renamed it Bethel. House of God. That's what that means. So we were trying to decide which time, right? Because we did a little research and God appeared to him twice at Bethel, once on his way out of the country to find a wife, and then once not long after arriving back. And then God appeared to him again at Beersheba, which we just talked about. I don't know if it was last week or the week before.
Right. Where he told him that that he used to go down to Egypt and he'll make him a great nation there, and that he would go with him before. That's what we studied just recently. But it seems like he's wanting Joseph to know or remember that experience at Luz because of the foreshadowing of that increasing in number and being fruitful.
And he's passing down the covenant to Joseph. Remember we talked in previous weeks about how it was being transmitted, like did they tell each other stories? I was just in a class this week where the leader suggested that everything was passed down orally, that nothing was ever written down, and that maybe some of the tales got embellished over time or were made more interesting and colorful so they could be remembered. And I'm not saying that none of that happened, but we do have, this is a moment in the written record anyway, where Jacob is formally passing down the stipulations of the covenant to Joseph. Now, he doesn't mention the covenant with Abraham or with Isaac. He specifically calls Joseph attention to the one God made with him, which is really a recapitulation of the others. And it looks like he's referring to Genesis 35, verses 9 through 15, which is the second of God's appearances to Jacob at Bethel. At that point, Joseph was a young child, and Benjamin was not yet born, but he was in the world. His mother was pregnant with him, and she would soon give birth to him and perish in the doing. So that's when God appears to him. And this is the passage. It's Genesis 35, beginning in verse 9. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram, and he blessed him. God said to him, your name is Jacob. No longer shall you be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. So he was called Israel. God said to him, I am El Shaddai. I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall spring from you. The land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you. Then God went up from him at the place where he had spoken with him. Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone, and he poured out a drink offering on it and poured oil on it. So Jacob called the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. It's after that he leaves Bethel, and they're on their way to what would later be Bethlehem. Rachel's in birth. She has that hard labor, and then she dies in birthing Benjamin, and she's buried on the way to Bethlehem, which at that time was called Ephrath. And of course, later, when in the days of Jesus, when Herod kills the children of Bethlehem looking for him, they quote the prophet Jeremiah, who says, Rachel weeping
Mhm.
for her children, for they are no more. The
Mhm.
weeping of Rachel comes from this passage when she's crying out in childbirth.
Mhm.
And of course, her children are Benjamin and Ephraim. And Jeremiah is basically saying that because of the sins of Israel, those tribes are going to be wiped out.
Mhm.
So Rachel weeping for her children, they are no more. And that happened in history when the Assyrians destroyed the northern empire
Mhm.
of Israel. And it happened again when Herod killed the children of Bethlehem. All, we just throw out all the scriptures, but you can see how it all works together.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's putting the string through all these hoops helps a lot to try to understand how this is going. And Jacob's trying to pass off this information to Joseph as if he wouldn't know it again, but he's trying to remind him of it, I would think.
Yeah,
And
and it's probably a moment Joseph would remember, because that's why I reiterated it. This is the occasion of his mother's death.
right,
She dies just after that visitation of God. So
yeah,
Jacob is recalling not only a very important moment in his life, but also a very critical and sad and family breaking story, because both Jacob and Joseph, right after this visitation, lose Rachel.
right, right,
Yeah. So it's a pretty poignant moment, and he passes down the stipulations of the covenant. And that he should do, because Joseph is his heir. The
right.
heir becomes responsible to carry the story.
Mhm. Yeah, I think the next section really helps us to understand what those covenants are. So when Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, "Who are these?" Joseph said to his father, "These are my sons whom God has given me here." And he said, "Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, and he could not see well. So Joseph brought near to him, and he kissed them and embraced them. Israel said to Joseph, "I did not expect to see your face, and here God has let me see your children also." Then Joseph removed them from his father's knees and bowed himself with his face to the earth. Joseph took both Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near to him. But Israel stretched out his right hand, and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. He blessed Joseph, and he said, "The God before whom my ancestors Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who redeemed me from all harm, bless the boys, and in them let my name be perpetuated, and name the name of my ancestors Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude on the earth." When Joseph saw that his father had laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. So he took his father's hands to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. Joseph said to his father, "No, not so, my father. Since this one is the firstborn, put your right hand on his head." But the father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations." So he blessed them that day, saying, "By you, Israel, I will invoke blessings, saying, God make you like Ephraim and like Manasseh." So he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, "I'm about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your ancestors. I now give to you one portion more than to your brothers, the portion I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow."
So we should recognize a couple of themes,
Mm-hmm.
right? First, Jacob is also going blind in his old age. That happened to his father. We're not medical doctors and we can't diagnose them, but given the area they live in and the sun and being shepherds, I would imagine cataracts are the most likely affliction, but maybe not. Hard to say. But they're both going blind. And that brings us back to the story of Jacob and Esau, because when Isaac was going blind, Jacob used that to his advantage to deceive him and steal the birthright and the blessing. We do notice, at least here, that Joseph makes no attempt to deceive Jacob in any way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little different story in that respect.
Right.
And yet Jacob was the younger. Esau was the elder. God prophesied before they were born that the elder will serve the younger. Jacob and his mother brought that prophecy to fruition through craft and deceit.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think Jacob chooses the younger of Joseph's sons to give the greater blessing? Do you think he believed that the prophecy made to Rebekah, his mother, was to be passed on? Or do you think it's just the decision that he made, or do you think he was inspired by God to do it in the moment?
Well, to be perfectly honest with that, I really don't know, but I would guess that, or would want to think that there was more to the story than just preferential being able to say, well, I'm the youngest, so this is what we're going to do, kind of thing. So in other words, that prophecy applied for further down the road. So it doesn't feel like, or it doesn't indicate anywhere in my mind that it was something that was supposed to be carried on. It sure seems like it's his preference. It would be nice. I think it would be good to say that he had inspiration, but I can't see where that came from.
Yeah, I'd like to say that the Lord inspired it, but based on how the future goes and how God decides through Moses and Joshua to distribute the tribal allotments, I don't think God follows what Jacob expects here. So if it were inspired by God, I would expect God to do exactly what Jacob says. Not that the text isn't inspired, the text is, but I'm not sure Jacob was in this instance.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, he does have precedent, right? I suspect he does this because he knows something about God. He's learned that God likes to lift up the lesser
Mm-hmm.
over the greater.
Mm-hmm.
He might think that that's a principle. And it is a principle that God lifts up the humble. Of course, Jacob's not willing. If Jacob really wanted to live that out, he would not have given the birthright to Joseph and the blessing, right? He would have given it to like one of the children of the concubine. So he understood of one of the concubines.
Yeah.
But he does seem to understand this reversal as essential to what he knows about God. And it might be because of that prophecy. So I do think he's trying to live out what he believes he knows about this God.
Yeah, I'm not sure about how old these boys were at that point in time. It says sons, but
So I'm just guessing. I think, aren't they born during the famine?
Yeah.
I mean, during the years of plenty.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
We're within the first 7, and then there's 7 years of famine. And then I think Jacob has lived, I'm just doing this from memory, 17 years in the land by this point, which might include 5 of those have to be during the famine, because we knew there were 5 left. And then there are 12 more. So they have to be in their 20s. That would be my guess.
They're not little scrapping toddlers. These are just like when Hagar and Ishmael were out in the wilderness there, and he was underneath the tree. A lot of people think he was a baby, but he was actually 17 years old, I think.
Exactly. Yeah.
So these weren't like little boys. These,
Yeah, these are men themselves, and who knows, they may have been married. We don't even know at this point. But Jacob is insistent that he's going to give the greater blessing, whatever that means, to the younger of the two.
Right.
Who is Ephraim.
And that's kind of the way a lot of things happen in the Bible, where you think about David being the youngest, a king, and yet Saul was the direct opposite, who was head and shoulders above everybody else. But the point is that usually it's the unlikely.
God does like the idea of reversal. So I think Jacob's right about that. I think he understands God correctly there. I'm not sure he applies it correctly in this case. If he did, I would expect God to follow his advice a little more strictly.
Yeah.
But I think God divides the blessing and the birthright among Joseph's sons. As I interpret the ongoing history as it unfolds in the days of Joshua, Ephraim definitely seems to get the blessing that Jacob intended for him. But it looks to me like Manasseh gets the birthright, the double portion.
Mm-hmm. So could we say that we may be thinking that, I hate to use the word, but there's more of a change in this idea, a movement and fluctuation within the blessing and the birthright as interpreted by the Father, right? Would we agree on that?
Yeah. If what you're saying is that Jacob is in some ways guessing how he's not guessing that he should hand it down, and he's not guessing that Joseph should be his heir. Those things seem very solid in his mind, though I do wonder if he's right about that. That still could be a guess, because God really is going to favor Judah.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of how he distributes this, I do think he's doing his best to guess how God would want it handed down.
Yeah. It's certainly more complicated than Abraham or Isaac's situation.
Because Jacob wants to make room for all of his sons, and they didn't.
Yeah, right.
So this is more complicated for sure.
Yeah.
But it's more complicated for the right reasons.
Right.
Jacob is trying to make space within his blessing for all of his children, mm-hmm. including the children of his concubines. He brings them all in as equals.
Yeah. So do you think verse 10, where he talks about his eyes being dim, do you think it's trying to parallel or familiarize you with the experience that, like I think you said before, with Isaac?
I think so.
I think that's in their intention.
I mean, I think it was true. I think he did start to go blind, but I think it's mentioned by the prophetic tradition to bring us back to the room where he deceived his father. And he's come a long way. Yeah. And his children don't deceive him.
Right. That's right. He's able to identify them, even though if he can't see them that well, he doesn't even know who they are.
Right. But one thing he's planned, and I don't know if the children know it, but I think they do, is that where Jacob and Esau seem to have known that there was only one blessing to be had, and they were fighting over it. Mm-hmm. Jacob has made room to bless all of his children. That might be why they're not wrangling, because they know that they're all going to get a blessing. They don't know exactly what it is, maybe, and maybe till right now, mm-hmm. Joseph seems to know he's the heir. He brings both of his sons to Jacob. But beyond that, they may not know what these blessings are going to entail. But I'm wondering if Jacob's promise to bless them all, something Isaac never said, might have put off some of that wrangling.
Yeah. It sounds like he planned ahead.
And we'll see this on our next discussion, but he has some really good blessings for some of the others. It's not like he gives the lion's share to Joseph and nobody's got anything else. It's not that way at all. He's put a lot of thought into this. And some of it, especially the blessing about Judah, God takes very, very seriously and ends up bringing it almost pitch perfectly into fruition. Mm-hmm. But I still think it's God that would have to choose to do this.
Yeah.
Though I'm not saying that if you think that Jacob is a prophet in this case, okay, that's fine. I mean, he is a prophet of a sort. But the question is God telling him what to say, or is he doing his best and God deciding what to ratify? I think it's the latter, but it could be the former.
Well, I think, as a father, and as I think you would probably agree, as a father, you would like to give a good blessing to your children.
Yeah, and if I had this many, it'd be hard to come up with unique things for each of them, but Jacob does it.
Yeah, he's been thinking a while. Even if one of them is calling you a female deer.
Right.
But I think we should talk about the 15 and 16 here. That
Yeah, so this is an interesting, this is the blessing that he gives to Joseph. The God before whom my ancestors Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day. That's a uniquely Abrahamic comment, right? Because they are shepherds.
mm-hmm.
The angel who has redeemed me from all harm. Bless the boys, and in them let my name be perpetuated in the name of my ancestors Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude on the earth.
Mm.
We have to deal with the language because it's interesting, especially the angel language.
Yep.
But this is fulfilled in a very interesting way. Because the truth is, in history, Ephraim and Manasseh become part of the lost tribes of Israel. They're scattered. And it's Judah who is the only one left by the days of Jesus, which is why the people are called Jews,
Mm-hmm.
which is a shortened form of Judah.
Mm-hmm.
So Ephraim and Manasseh are not technically the tribes in which the name of Abraham and Isaac are preserved.
Mm-hmm.
It's really going to be through Judah that occurs, at least in the flesh. But what's interesting is that the scattering of those tribes opens the door for God to redeem all Gentiles.
Mm-hmm.
And you might say that the Gentiles are grafted into the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh.
Yeah, well, that's definitely the Pauline or what Paul talks about, right?
Right. God scatters the northern tribes and they intermarry with the nations. And so, in order to redeem all of Israel, God has to open the gospel to Gentiles in order to open it to the lost tribes of Israel. So, it's very interesting that Ephraim and Manasseh and the fate of the northern tribes becomes the fate of the Gentiles.
Yeah.
So, they are actually larger than Judah, even though they're lost. It's a very interesting the way the history ends up unfolding. And Jacob does catch a bit of it. So I'm not saying the spirit is here.
Yeah.
You know, the spirit is here. But let's deal with that angel language. So you did a little bit of research. The perplexing thing I didn't realize it was such a perplexing thing for Jewish theologians till you pointed me to the article that we discussed before we recorded. But apparently it's been an issue for Jewish theologians through history as well. This idea of calling God an angel.
Mm-hmm.
So based on your own research, I have some comments about that, like the way I thought of it. And then you pointed me to an article by Michael Heiser where he has a slightly different opinion. And we both now become exposed to this idea of the two powers theory that was present in Judaism that I didn't know anything about till we read the article. So you want to fill us in a little bit on some of how this verse has been influencing the discussion?
Well, the article kind of brings out this idea that there were two, pretty much a way of looking at God in the traditions where it was the invisible nature of God and the visible nature of God. So that there was this idea of the God who's seen and the God who is, and this concept is brought up or talked about it because of this passage where it says the God before whom my ancestors and Abraham and Isaac walked. That, in other words, that is talking about this invisible, unseen kind of God. But then the angel in verse 16, the angel who has rescued me from all harm, that is a more visible type of manifestation, or should we say, or revelation of this God who delivered. And so the actual article brings out the idea that the word angel in a lot of ways basically just reflects this idea of a messenger, but the actual it being is singular, so it seems to reflect the this unseen or this seen nature of God as the angel. And so when we hear these texts where it says the angel who has redeemed me, it's a presence, God's presence there, and it seems to be this idea of fusing these two together. So it's a form of revealing God as being, well, not dual in nature, but by nature, by what's the exact word they use? Binitary.
Yeah.
Binitarian. Is that how you say it? Or binitarian?
Yeah. Instead of
Uh,
Trinitarian at this point.
yeah. So it's an interesting. It kind of splits my brain to start thinking like this, but because we and an example could be where Moses says, I want to see your face, and God, and this is a real physical presence
Yeah.
where God says, you can't see my face, but I'll let you see my back, and I'll put my hand over a cave or a
Right.
cleft. And that's a real human way to describe God's presence.
Yeah.
And in some ways there's this idea being talked about here. So this is an example in that this article uses to talk about this unseen and also or invisible and invisible aspects of revealing who God is. And I think in some ways, just to as we were reading this verses 15 and 16, I felt like this was more kind of a testimony of things that Jacob has experienced. He's saying this God who was with Abraham brought him all out of Ur and told him he would bring him to a place that he would show him, and then Isaac walking at, being put up on the altar and then seeing the actual deliverance from God. This kind of faith to say that this is a God who has been my shepherd all my life, and not only reveals that he was a shepherd and he understood, Jacob that is, understanding all about how to take animals and how to protect them and increase them when he was with Laban, Jacob was with Laban, that almost foreshadows what happens to him with his family. He's got flocks upon flocks, and he's able to increase in number. It's a beautiful thing, but he's saying God has been my shepherd all my life to this day. All these things, the hardships that he's gone through, the difficulties he's been through, but God has been the shepherd. To me, this is like a testimony of his presence, but also he changes the way he talks about this presence by saying the angel who redeemed me from all harm.
Yeah.
It's quite powerful. I think if I could give a blessing to my kids, I think I would like to do something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it reminds you of one of Jacob's descendants by way of his son Judah, David, who wrote Psalm 23. He also said, the Lord is my shepherd, shall not want. And of course, David himself was a shepherd. He watched over his family sheep. So oftentimes we read Psalm 23, we said, oh, look at this. David's writing out of his experience. But we shouldn't forget the family of Abraham was shepherds, and this is the word Jacob gave. So David is speaking in a much richer tradition than just his own experience as a shepherd, but the people of God as shepherds. And he almost quotes Jacob in that psalm, right? The Lord is my shepherd.
Right. And it's so bizarre because you really think about Joseph when he was with them before he went into Egypt. He wasn't really a shepherd at all.
Joseph was like, I don't know what he was, the overseer or whatever. His brothers thought he was a little bit entitled. He wasn't doing a lot of shepherding.
That's right. So it's like you remember that this is Jacob talking to Joseph,
yeah.
telling him that the Lord has been my shepherd all this time, and this is what I want for your boys.
Yeah, and we remember this is a big distinction between Jacob and Esau. Esau liked to go out and hunt, but Jacob liked to stay and tend the flocks. So this shepherding language is very distinctive to Jacob. It's also one of the things that distinguished him from his brother Esau, who was always out adventuring.
Right. So this idea of talking about God's presence, I think people might read this and just say, "Oh, this is a nice blessing," but he's saying he wants the presence of God to be with these
And
boys.
his understanding of God is born out of his experience with God. And he's speaking of God in very personal terms. These are not generic theological categories that he's using.
Mm-hmm.
He's talking about a God he knows personally, and he's had personal experiences with this God, and he describes this God based on his own walk with him. Very personal. I think it's beautiful. It's not, but like I said, it's not just these esoteric qualities that you might associate with a God. He doesn't speak of God's omniscience. He doesn't speak of God's all-powerful nature. He doesn't speak of God as the greatest of the Elohim, even though all those things may be true. For Jacob, this is the God who has shepherded me. This is the God who redeemed me when I was in trouble. This is the God who promised to make my name great, and I'm asking him to do it through your sons. You know, this is a very personal blessing based on personal experience with God.
Yeah, and if, I mean, in the other chapters, I might interject here, is you don't really see that in his sons or other people. So he's saying somebody's got to continue this type of legacy.
Yeah.
And
so he's the God of Abraham. Jacob will call him the fear of Isaac. And that's out of Isaac's experience, right? This is the God who had his fathers get ready to sacrifice him up on the hill. You know, Isaac's understanding of God is quite different than Jacob's. But if we were to say it as Genesis reveals it, it would be the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac, and the shepherd of Jacob, right?
Yeah.
The redeemer of Jacob.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as you were talking, the angel God, many of our readers may recognize that in the Old Testament and the First Testament, especially in the book of Genesis, there's a figure called the angel of the Lord or the angel of God who appears. And it can be very difficult to tell the difference between the angel of the Lord and God himself. Sometimes it's almost used interchangeably, and other times they look like two distinct figures. And we see that here, right, in this Jacob's blessing, the God before whom my ancestors walked, the angel who redeemed me from all harm. And I think you're absolutely right. In some ways, the one is a more spiritual being that's somewhat greater, transcendent. And then the other is the one that he encountered, the angel he encountered. But it led to some interesting discussions I didn't know about. I didn't realize that by the intertestamental period, there were some Jewish groups who believed in two powers, as though the angel of the Lord and the Lord were both God, but somehow to be distinguished. And that might have been a precursor to the eventual Trinitarian doctrine that we get in the New Testament. And Michael Heiser suggests that it's possible the New Testament writers began to associate Jesus with the angel of the Lord as that second power, as they developed an understanding of God that made room for Jesus, and eventually came to the Trinitarian conclusion a few centuries later. That's interesting. Heiser suggests, similar to what you've said, that angel means messenger, and anyone who bears a message is an angel. You can have an angel coming from a human or from God. It's not a being term. It's not an ontological term. The way we use the term angel today, we are meaning spiritual being. But the term for spiritual being in the scriptures, there are multiple, but they're usually either Elohim, gods, or sons of God, B'nai Elohim, sons of God. Those are the spiritual beings. Angel is more of a task-oriented term. If you bear a message, you're an angel. And if you bear a message from God, then you're a spiritual being who is an angel. And if you bear a message from other humans, you're just an angel, just a messenger. So Dr. Michael Heiser suggests that here Jacob's not making a big theological statement. He's simply saying that it was God who bore the message to him personally. So God is the angel. In that case, God is the messenger. Maybe he's right about that. That would make a lot of sense. And that would be fine with me. But it's not typically the way that I've understood it, because in Protestant theology, some folks believe, and I was certainly taught this by at least one professor in my undergrad that I can remember, that the angel of the Lord is actually what theologians call a theophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus to the people of the Old Testament. So there are some who see the angel of the Lord directly connected with Jesus as a theophany, and that's possible. We remember that the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, this is Hebrews chapter 1, chapter 2, verse 1 says, we must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we've heard so that we don't drift away. For since the message spoken through angels was binding, and every violation and disobedience received its just punishment, how shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation as mediated to us by Jesus? I fill in.
Mm-hmm.
He's suggesting that the covenant of Sinai was spoken through angels. Now, of course, in the scriptures, it was God himself. But it might be this angel of the Lord idea that God was using a mediator to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
So it could actually be an angel that God selected to be his messenger, and that when the ancients were talking to God, they were actually talking through an angelic messenger. That's possible that that could be the way too. Mm-hmm. So a lot of things come up in this passage. We're not sure. Is the angel of the Lord, as Heiser says, just a way of saying that God himself is talking himself and is therefore the angel, the messenger? Mm-hmm. Is that it? Or is the angel of the Lord a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus to the people in the Old Testament? Is this a theophany? Or is God choosing one of his angelic hosts to bear a message for him, speaking directly for him? And so there is actually an angel between the speaking of God and the hearing of the people. Mm. I don't know which one of the three. And Jacob doesn't really clear it up for us, except to say that the same God that his ancestors walked before has spoken to him, that's the angel language, and redeemed him from harm. Mm-hmm. And he, of course, has a whole history where that's true. Saves him from Laban, saves him from the vengeance of the people of the land when they do the Shechem thing,
Esau.
Simeon and Levi. And he saved him from a famine too, by bringing him here to Egypt. So God has definitely done this. But it's an interesting little theological conundrum that his language brings back to the surface for us. And there's no one clear answer.
Right.
Well, maybe there's one clear answer. There are not two gods.
Right.
But how we come to understand how this language is to be understood is still a matter of debate.
Right. Yeah. And the idea of talking about God as being the unseen God, and then the God as he's revealed to us, I think it's quite powerful, but hard to delineate unless you can really understand the Hebrew grammar really well. It helps with that.
I'm not sure the grammar helps us settle the issue so much.
Yeah.
Is there a physical manifestation that they're dealing with? Or is the manifestation simply the voice? It's hard to say. If there is a physical manifestation, is that an angel that God's using to communicate through? Or is that God taking some form himself? That would be the theophany language. We're not sure. You know, they tell us they have these encounters, but they don't give a lot of detail.
Right.
We know there's definitely a physical presence when Jacob wrestles the angel, who he thinks is God. Mm-hmm. So that's physical, because that's a physical wrestling match. Mm-hmm. Is that the angel of the Lord? And then is it Jesus? Is it a theophany? Or is it God just taking on some sort of incarnate form? Mm-hmm. Or is it an angel who speaks for God that he's wrestling with? It's not clear, but he brings us back to that moment right here in his blessing.
Right.
Maybe Jacob doesn't know. Maybe he's giving us all he can give.
Right.
Or maybe Heiser's right, and when God speaks for himself, it's right to call God the angel, the messenger, when he's doing it himself. And maybe that's all that's meant here.
Well, he's certainly wanting his descendants to have that same connection, though.
Yeah.
And I think that's a perfectly grandfather type or a father type desire, is that your children will know the Lord and will walk with them.
It's interesting, right? He hands down the covenant. The promises God made is what he hands down. Maybe we can learn from that. What are we to hand down to our children?
Right.
Jacob hands down his knowledge of God as he has experienced him to Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
And I would think we are beholden to do the same.
Yeah, I guess maybe you're saying, are you distinguishing between the birthright and the blessing, that the most important thing is actually the blessing?
The most important thing, I think, is the story, is the conditions of the covenant. I mean, whatever blessing or birthright comes with it, it seems to me it runs secondary to this, to the covenant that Jacob is trying to pass down to Joseph, that the real blessing is the covenant.
Mm.
You know, Jacob has property, and he's definitely giving Joseph more of it than his brothers. So that is a blessing, right? That's a birthright anyway. But the real blessing is not power over his brothers. It's not being the heir through whom all the kings will come. The real blessing is the covenant, the promise God made to Abraham. That's really what he's passing down. And he doesn't just pass that down to Joseph. He passes down that promise to all of his sons.
Right.
You know, that's not reserved for Joseph. Jacob does not seem to think Joseph alone will carry the promise made to Abraham.
Yeah.
We'll see in the next chapter. He believes that all of his sons will carry that message.
Is it safe to say that covenantal language or is really to be blessed and to be a blessing to the nations? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And it's being carried forward in this family line. They should never forget why they were chosen. They're not chosen for themselves. They're chosen to bless the nations. Right. They're to become a nation in order to reclaim the nations for God. And that is the legacy of Israel. And Jacob is reminding Joseph that that's why they were chosen. It's easy to forget that.
Right. And to focus on the physical. As much as the world in which we live in now, most people are thinking or trying to prepare for retirement or for their what they can pass on to their families. And I think probably that's maybe the biggest lesson today for us is to remember what's most important, and that's what I think. What is it in 3 John? It says it's a blessing that my children walk with God. I think That's how it goes.
Yeah, of course, John in that context is talking about the church that he planted.
Yeah.
But of course, we would like to see our children walk in faithfulness as well. And Jacob is challenging both Joseph, who's there, and his grandchildren, who are also there, that God would be known through them. That's the point, right?
Yeah.
God chose Israel to make himself known to the nations.
That's right.
That's why. And Jacob is reminding them, this is what I'm asking for. That you will be known, that God will be known by his fulfillment of his promises made to me. But that he'll be known through you.
Right.
You know, Jacob wants the knowledge of God in the world. And his family is, at this point, the only ones. Well, I shouldn't say the only ones, right? Because Abraham ran into Melchizedek.
Yeah.
So, but they are the only ones to know God this personally.
Yeah. Or at least for us to even to know about. Yeah. I mean.
So it's a very unique and intimate knowledge of God Jacob has received, and he wants that to continue.
Right.
So he blesses Joseph.
Right.
We thank the Lord that he answered his prayer and that the knowledge of God is still in the world. Jacob would be pleased. One day when we meet Jacob in heaven, one of the things we can all say to him is, Jacob, God answered your prayer. God has been made known through your children.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. And of course, his descendant, and Jesus is a descendant of Jacob in the flesh.
Yeah. I think just as a little teaser, it would be good for us to talk about that last verse about the portion of the Amorites. Is that calling back to what God told Abraham about the 440 years, the time of the Amorites have not been completed yet? Is that the same deal?
I don't know. We'll save that for our next conversation because I got to do a little more research. I'm not quite ready to talk about it at this point because I'm not recalling, and maybe you recall, but I don't recall a story in Jacob's life where he does this.
Yeah.
Now, when Levi and Simeon destroy the Shechemites, that is a violent act that removes an entire city. And I think the Shechemites are Amorites.
Yeah.
So maybe he's talking about that. And if he's talking about Shechem, that city ends up in the tribe of Manasseh. So he may be talking about that. That's the only thing I can think of in his life where somebody associated with him conquered somebody and took land.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what else he could be referring to.
Yeah, what's baffling to me is the sword and the bow, because he paid them money for the land.
Well, but Levi and
Shechem.
Simeon slaughtered the Shechemites, so I don't know. Maybe they used sword and bow.
Right. Yeah, we can talk about it next time.
Let's give that a little bit more thought for our next one, and our listeners can give it a little more thought too. Maybe next time we'll come up. The only thing that occurs to me is that he's referring to the slaughter of the Shechemites by Levi and Simeon.
Yeah, we can let people put those in the comments or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we don't have comments on YouTube, but they can make comments on the podcast if they want to switch over to wayoflife.podbean.com, which is where the audio versions release.
Yeah.
You can put comments there.
Yeah. So I think this is a short chapter, but I think it's pretty loaded. I think we talked about some good stuff.
Yeah. And we're going to have quite a lion's share of things to do to prefigure a bit of Judah's blessing next time, because all the blessings that he's reserved for the other children we'll talk about, and they all have their own various ways of playing out through Israelite history. Very interesting.
Right. Yeah. It's gonna be fun to talk about it.
Well, thanks for joining me again, Minister Joe, for this discussion. I hope this was helpful. I know there's a lot of history and geopolitics in this one, but it fills out the rest of the biblical story. So I find it useful.
Yeah. It's good. I think it's good for us to process as fathers and also as leaders, to encourage others to be a blessing, to understand the connectedness of a father's blessing to their sons and daughters, that there's a bigger picture than just material things.
If you want to put into practice the example of Jacob in these respects, then you want to have something for all of your children that you can give them. You want to expect all of them to carry on the story of our walk with God. That's the most important story, not just family history, but our family history with God. And maybe a little bit of reversal, where the ones who think they are owed more don't necessarily get more. Maybe all of that would be part of Jacob's legacy.
Right. Yeah, you might be surprised by the ones who will invest more.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Minister Joe, again. And we'll see you next week.
Yes, thank you so much. Blessings on you.